Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I started in the last video with settler colonialism and space. I really think that settler colonialism has so much to talk about in terms of like core critiques of the resolution because of the way in which it indicts like the idea and desire to go to space in the first place, the way that it relates to critiques of the public-private divide, and just the way it really questions like how humanity attempts to like think through like the justifications for why space exploration is necessary, which I think are key to being able to critique some of the really deep values in the resolution about vitality and about the idea for like the necessity of like infinite human survival and questions like that, all of which I really think are really interesting to kind of like talk about in terms of their different relationships as negative arguments, affirmative arguments, how people should answer them. And so I hope that this series will be really engaging in terms of like giving you like an idea of like how what I think will be a really core criticism for this resolution will really end up working on all different sides of the debate. And in this particular video, I want to talk about settler colonialism as a negative argument for the space privatization. I really think that this argument is like really important regardless of whether or not you're a critical team, policy team, or whether you read settler colonialism or not, because I think preparing for all the ways in which this argument can show up at various points in the debate is super important, and it's something that I think I'll try to talk about from all vantage points, which is something I don't always do with all of the series, and I try to like keep them in the most relevant parts. But I think that this particular criticism has a lot of weight to bear on the resolution as a whole, and so I'll probably be talking about it at least against every argument, and hopefully how every other argument can kind of like interact and answer it as well. And so hopefully this kind of like series will be helpful in breaking that down. I kind of want to start in this video off just talking a little bit about like what are some of the priorities when you're trying to figure out what you should be kind of like focusing on in order to make this criticism work as a negative strategy versus policy teams. I think that some of the priorities for like where you really want to focus your energy in the criticism is really trying to figure out how you can really destroy the idea that there is kind of like this inevitability that space has to be this kind of like thing that's colonized, and that like it's something that humans will kind of like do inevitably, and it's like part of that kind of like essential identity for us to be able to think about various other ways to resolve and respond to things like space debris and other possible like extinction-based crises. I think that in order for you to kind of like make sense of like how that is working, a lot of the kind of like places where you really need to be situating your offense is like reasons why their impact calculus is wrong, why it's invested in human vitality, and those things produce a particular relationship to the erasure of like indigenous genocide because it's seen as like a process of creating like and generating resources for necessary human survival, why the kind of like idea of being able to think of space as this like morally clean place for us to be able to create a new society on reenacts the same kind of like settler imaginaries that like make literally the foundation of like how we're able to think about the United States and other sources of violence right now like as kind of like literal apparatuses of like colonial violence broadly and internationally, all of which I think are really important places for you to build like really good offense that can kind of like hold throughout the debate and will be pertinent to like every single portion of like the arguments that you're reading, regardless of whether or not they're like framing or the thesis or like some of the more nitty-gritty portions like your link argument, permutation, impact comparison, alternative debating. And I think that when I'm just trying to generally consider like what is the best way for you to be framing the debate, I definitely feel like your argument needs to be arguments about like why we should refuse settler futurity, why we should be engaging in the question of like how we relate to settler futurity and like the relevance that it has to like what we're thinking about politically and like culturally. I think there are so many arguments to make about like why imageries of like human survival and like settler futurity and the ability to think about like bare land for like the process of colonization are kind of essential to the ways in which settler colonialism is continued as a process of erasure, and how it's able to create the kind of like justification for like killing whatever is in front of it in order to create and generate that resourcefulness. And so I feel like if you can create a framing argument that allows you to win, that if the affirmative is in like that invests in that same type of settler imaginary, that you should be able to vote neg, then there are really interesting ways for you to be able to like create a framing argument that doesn't require you to win a lot of alternative solvency, but just allows you to build a link threshold that is like really comfortable in terms of like how you're able to explain like the various ways in which these different link arguments kind of like show up as arguments not only at like the link debate proper, but also as offense that kind of like is done by how you impact turn like what the 2AC does to defend the 1AC, how you're being able to impact turn like what other places they're attempting to frame you out and turn those into like offense for you. And I feel like there are so many net benefits to make about like how settler futurity is like produced epistemologically and the way that it's like passed pedagogically through various ways of like studying and thinking about the world and various sources of policy, all of which I think are really relevant to the question of like what the 1AC like does in and outside of debate. I then think that as you kind of like are trying to consider how you're able to weigh this against like some of the other procedural concerns that teams may be making. I feel like a lot of the arguments you want to make is that the kind of like the justification for like what happens once we the conversation of what happens once we get out to space is just as relevant as how we get there or what enterprise we do use to get there. It's not just an end all be all of whether or not we're able to like make that happen, because there are worlds in which the way in which we get out there and the kind of like objective that we have once we get out there makes it unethical to a point where we should have just kind of like allowed ourselves to risk a different way of like living in the face of the kind of like existential crisis that the affirmative will be offering. And I think that using that to frame a lot of the ways in which you're kind of like pushing arguments about how you're able to kind of like demand something a little bit more from the process of debating itself, and why that still allows for fair contestation of like some of the core values that are present in the affirmative, then you have a lot of room to work off of that it's like really strategic for you. I then think that when you're trying to shift into like how you should be kind of arguing some of like your thesis concerns and making those core criticisms, I think that a lot of your thesis portion of the debate just needs to really zone in on being able to win that the way in which they're kind of the thesis debate kind of like focuses on being able to determine like the idea of like what settler futurity is, and like whether or not you can like be unbounded from it through the process of policy. I feel like you need to have really good arguments about like why the kind of like sovereign capacity of like the public in general to be an actor or agent of the government doesn't actually allow for a representation of like how settler erasures or forms of indigenous erasure are like not really represented within like larger public demand, and how that public is dominated by a particular relationship to whiteness and colonial desire that ultimately like makes it harder to imagine like a world where we're able to kind of like think about like what resistance to like a space colonization rhetoric and things look like. And I feel like there's so many arguments for you as well to make about like why there's kind of like this like toxic or violent relationship between the ability for there to be scientific and technological achievement for the world outwardly, and for there to be a recognition of the way in which we like how we got to the point where this world was so destroyed, where we needed to travel to space in the first place. And making arguments about why the erasure of that history produces like violence is, I think, like really important to being able to have a strong criticism that kind of like wraps out like why your framing arguments are so pertinent to the types of arguments you're going to start making throughout the rest of the flow. And so hopefully this video is kind of good in starting to put those pieces together for you in order to kind of set up some of the stuff for the next video when we start talking about linked debate, permutation debating, impact comparison debating, and alternative debating a lot more. So yeah, thank you as always for watching, and hopefully you tune in for more.